Welcome back. You're watching Sokoni here on Morning Prime. And at a tune of 44.6 billion shillings, Kenya's just concluded general election is among the most expensive in the world. This means that for the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, IBC, to conduct the exercise that was to involve 22,120,258 registered voters, it will be spending about 2,000 shillings per voter. What makes the Kenyan election budget this high? How has elections been performing over the years? This is what we want to break it down right now. Many thanks, Calvin. But the problem question is then, why do we spend these eye-popping figures on election, yet we don't get it right? Right? Just across in Rwanda, we've been given an example. At least 553 is what we can spend on, one person going to that polling station. Here, it's almost 2,000, actually 2,000 shillings per person. We don't know what will really happen when we come to the next electioneering period. But let me just pick up the brains of Dr. McPhee on this. And you've had Rwanda, where Patrick Obathi is saying, you're one of the agents of President Kagame there.
I was once in Kigali, and we're having lunch in a hotel there, the 1,000 Hills or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
And the two gentlemen with whom I was having lunch went over to serve themselves, because in Rwanda, actually, you to actually order something from the kitchen is a little bit of a problem. Okay, because you never know whether it's going to be poisoned on the way out and so on. So you go and serve yourself, and they left their phones on the table. So I stood by the table until they came back, and I said, "Look, you two gentlemen, you left your phones on the table here. Are they going to be here when you get back?" And they said, no, this is not Nairobi. This is not Nairobi. That was it. Now, you see, when you have trust in a nation,
yes,
okay, everything is going to be cheaper. And what do we have at the moment? In fact, we don't know whether some of these 34Cs were substituted with other ones. We just don't know whether that is the case or not. And so the problem here, okay, is that you have a system which you're trying to build in checks and balances at that particular level. That costs money. And I think we've always got to look at the situation and ask ourselves, what is the cost benefit analysis here? Have we really thought about that?
Yes.
Because I think for example, I just don't understand, for example, how there are different numbers of papers for the president, for the governor, for the MCAs. When I went to vote, I got 6 papers. Every paper was put into the box. Those numbers should be equal right across the whole of the 46,000 counting stations that we had. Why is that different? Well, that's a question, we got to ask ourselves, how can that be different? And, is it that people don't know how to count? Mind you, I know myself, I was marking a paper for 85 students 2 days ago. And, when you got 85 students, even to get all the marks correct and so on is difficult. When you've got 46,000 and 14 million voters, it's very, very much more complicated. A lot of people say, well, it's just a simple counting thing. But to get things right, I was reading the article in the newspaper yesterday, and there were 2 different numbers in 2 different articles. So which is the correct number? So I think we got to understand, we go back to the idea of trust. If we were honest, it would be easier to run our election, okay? And we've got to try to have this as one of our national values. It's a value which has to be built in Kenya, which we don't have at the moment. Maybe I'm wrong.
And it's costing us.
It's costing us.
Yes.
It costs us money.
Patrick?
I fully agree with Jim. I mean, our elections, the high cost of our elections is a cost of mistrust. Why is this magical thing called a server jumping up every time? Right? I never understand what this server is. I mean, these elections were changed completely, and we went to counting votes, and I think the High Court, the Supreme Court said that the result is what is at the
polling
station. Period. Right? So this whole expensive thing about servers and this and the other and 0.00 whatever it is and coming out or whatever it is, I just think it's a big circus. Trust is a key thing. There is a company in the US where people's salaries are normally a thing that nobody wants to talk about. But there are a company where they're told, guys, you make so much money and a percentage of that becomes your salary, and then you decide how much you're going to each earn. And these guys sit together and actually work out how they're going to spend out the money that has been given as the salary pot amongst themselves. There isn't a system, there's nothing. That for me is an ultimate indication of trust within an organization, whereby you all know what you do and you can sit down and actually decide how much money you're going to be paid out of a pot. Now, we need to start on the basis of what the Constitution gave us, chapter 6 in this country. That is the one chapter that is talked most about, but very little is done about it. In most places people talk, we've got to implement this, we've got to implement that, and so forth and so on. Even in the private sector, when you start talking about trust and and integrity, there are issues. There's a time we tried to get companies to sign up to be in, to sort of compete on the basis of which is the most company that indicates the highest amount of integrity. But they would be judged by their peers, by people outside, who would say whether they believe that company is working with integrity or not. Companies refused. They refused to be judged by the court of public opinion, right? But yet because you know that your company isn't as clean as it should be, but you say it. So I think that our election costs will only come down to a reasonable level once people trust the electoral system. And that's why I think between one election and the next, the IEBC should be spending time building trust on the electoral system, but also putting in a system that can be trusted.
Which is this system? Because I think this system, I'm coming to that system is a holy grail.
I'm coming to that. We all trust this thing to transfer our money.
Yes.
Right? And we've got hackers, people globally who know how to hack systems. And yet we still send our money on this. And how much is lost? Very little. Yeah? Why can't we just use the simple infrastructure, the KYC that exists, do an audit, do the cleanup, and use digital systems? India is using it. India is using a digital system. Why can't we just contract people like that to come in, load our database in Kenya, run the elections, and move on? All they have is they have a system that works. They can bring it here, run it for us, independently, completely, right? And then move on. Yeah, I think I should actually create a business at the bank.
But if you say digital, isn't our election also digital?
No,
right?
I mean, no.
The bone of contention right now is hacking. We have 56 hackers
who don't vote digitally. Right? The hacking and all the rest of it, I think
it's a hybrid. We should say
that's whatever. No, we should actually have a digital system. If you give everybody a whatever Mulika Mwizi phone, which you can do USSD, and you built in all the checks and balances required there, could you vote digitally?
That they will still say the results have been hacked.
The server.
Yeah, whatever. Because you have to send that data somewhere. It's about the data.
Where is the data residing? Which is the server?
Where do you send from your phone? Where do you send that data?
And that server should be a critical infrastructure. Should actually
but
be.
That is the whole point. Is designing that infrastructure so it's critical. India does it, right? And they have distributed systems. They've got. I think there's blockchain as well to manage the flow of data. And if anybody changes it, they can find out where it happened.
Isn't it concerning that in this country, when we're talking about this electoral agency and the infrastructure, it's not listed as one of the critical infrastructures that you have to also safeguard it with very good heightened security?
That costs money.
It costs money.
I think Dibal, apart from the issue of the trust deficit in the country, which is always there when you have corruption in a nation. I mean, you cannot compare Rwanda or Kenya with other. I mean, you have to know that when you talk of trust, It's a question of the level of integrity in the country, the level of corruption, because that's where the question of trust comes in. Otherwise, if there was zero corruption, as another, then nobody would be doubting all those institutions. Everyone would be comfortable with the outcome. The second thing is they always tell you, the politicians, that democracy is expensive. That again makes things different for Kenya, because Kenya, the level of democracy is quite different. You cannot compare. You cannot have 40 people applying to be presidential candidates in Rwanda and get away with it. In this country, people run in their dozens for every office. The level of democracy at the grassroots, the national level, is also different. And I think thirdly, the issue is there is a lot at stake. In this country, government is business. Government is industry. You know that. So it's because of that, it's cutthroat. There's no one who would trust anyone, because they know that getting that position would mean for them, being in paradise and being in hell is different for them. The two situations are completely, because once you are there in that power, you are in the money. That's the way I look at it. You're running the resources of this country, you spend the way you want, you appoint whom you want, you do what you want. The level of accountability is low. So people are looking at the stakes. That's why, in spite of all the integrity that you can talk about in institutions, these features we are putting in, these controls we are putting in, the laws, you tighten. Every other election we disband the IEBC, we disband the anti-corruption agency. We have to, because if it's not working for me, it must be disbanded. I am not comfortable with that, because how did I fail? So it's going to be, it's not a very easy thing in this country, and the reason is mainly because government in this country is business. Is business, and so it's not just about leadership. It's not about, I try in other countries, you run for leadership, you lose, you don't even wait for elections. If you are not happy with a motion in parliament, you resign, or your government resigns. This is a country where even at gunpoint you don't want to resign. And you have seen it. Ministers who said, I would rather die than resign. So even at gunpoint you won't go. So I think, in my view, there are a lot of factors which play into the cost of the election because of that. Because every time we do something, for example, last 2017, the Supreme Court was very clear. They said what is important is that form which comes from the polling station, because people vote. 14 million voted there. It was counted, and the agent signed. That form is what counts. But now, the moment that form comes, you say no. It was intercepted on the way. The form was changed. So you can come up with every system in this country, but the mistrust will always be there because of the level of corruption in the country. Nobody can trust the other. Nobody trusts government institutions. Look at the perception survey, corruption perception survey that is published every year.
Yeah.
The government institutions are the ones leading. All of them, the judiciary, the parliament leads, the police, the security organs, they are the leading. So. Indeed. So no one can, comfortably. So if you're running for an office, you don't want to trust anyone in that place, including your own agents. They may be bought.
I always go back and tell people of my experience when I've been to Denmark so many times. I'm going into a conference. I'd walked from a hotel to about a kilometer away to this conference, and as I was arriving, this bicycle came along and somebody parked. And I was trying to get in, they pushed me aside. And the person who had come on the bicycle was told to go in. So I said, what's happening?
Discrimination.
That's the Prime Minister.
That's the Prime Minister.
Yes, the Prime Minister came to that meeting on a bicycle. Now, that for me is when things are working. Correct. People are they're doing a job, but they're living simply.
Correct.
Right? There's no this big demand for flash things, all these, cars with sirens, big houses. And if you look at the new sort of, the palatial buildings that have been brought up in the counties and stuff like that, the Prime Minister of a country lives in a flat and goes to work in a bicycle. That's where we need to start imagining ourselves going to. Because when you do that, right, it's going to be a long journey. But when you do that, you imagine all the costs that you strip out that can be applied to the development of the country and getting people going. Right? And that's where people pay tax, and they're willing to pay tax because they know the tax is being properly spent, and they don't have to run around, getting insurances for health and whatever, all the rest of it, because the health system runs. And really, I think our leadership that comes in should be campaigning on exactly what Bill has said, on changing the level of trust in this country and bring integrity. If the leaders themselves started that way, the country would change. But if they start the way they are, the country will not change. They can talk about it, but it won't change because they're not the example that people can follow.
Indeed. There's a very interesting, because you say comparing this, some of the public officials who are using bicycles. We had Angela Merkel as well, the Chancellor of Germany, living in an apartment. Here we want to have palatial homes. But if you also flip over to page 16 of the Daily Nation, where they're giving the public wage bill that has crossed now 500 billion shillings mark for the first time. And it could get even worse, they says, as the government has lifted hiring freeze. There was a freeze on hiring in the public sector. And they've even tabulated for you the way this wage bill has been rising since 2017 there. If my director would just pick up, this public wage bill crosses 500 billion shillings mark for the first time. Counties also living beyond their means, it says. We have 389 billion shillings. That is the wage bill. 2017, 2018. It had risen to 418 billion shillings. That is in 2018, 2019. 2019, 2020, that had risen also to 449.93 billion shillings. It went up in 2020, 2021. And this is when we had the pandemic. 493.03. This is page 16 of the Daily Nation. And the 2021, 2022, see, 520.03 billion shillings.
Yeah. Yes.
How do we pare down on this? I think this is where now even the new administration needs to look into the West that we're talking about. This 500 billion shillings for the first time crossing this mark, I think this is unsustainable. Why are you laughing? Bilokero.
Yeah, well, on the issue of wage bill, we have even at Parliament discussed so many times. First, I think how this 500 is measured is also critical. When you talk of public wage bill and talk of civil servants, there is the central government employees, there's the county government employees, then there are state corporations. Some of them, sometimes the way the wage bill is calculated by the Remuneration Commission, the SRC, is they factor in all state corporations, some of whom are actually very profitable companies. You saw KTNs and KCBs and everything where the government owns something. Sometimes you put in all the salaries, and then you cannot recruit in KTN, you can't recruit in this, you can't recruit in that. But because some institutions are really, commercial institutions that must run. But I think for the public service, I agree. The issue is when we did the Constitution in 2010, one of the underlying things is that we must rationalize our public service, cut down. That is why the ministries were reduced to 18. You remember they were 20 something.
Yes.
And the essence is so that we can effect this. But what the subsequent government, the last 10 years, have done is to circumvent that. So within one ministry, you have created 5, 6, 7 departments, and each one of them has a permanent secretary. And so all the ministries were left intact. That's one. Two, in devolution, services and functions were transferred to local county governments. But the national government refused to let go. And one of them, the most fundamental, is provincial administration, where if you look at the Constitution, that, should have gradually been completely, within the first few years, been eliminated. But today, the provincial administration has grown over the last 10 years. They're recruiting up to now more chiefs and more DOs and more DCs. By the day, they have created now the number of districts in the last 10 years have grown almost by double. So when you look at some of the functions that are supposed to be devolved, and we've tried to discuss these things with national government, including Treasury, this one that is complaining now, that look, take a good example of Ministry of Health. If you look at the Constitution, really over 90% of the functions should have been devolved, and they are. So that national government should remain with policy and the referral hospitals only. But you go to the Afia House, it's intact. It's the same way it was 10 years ago, nothing reduced. You go to Ministry of Water, we said everything, almost 80% of the functions are devolved. The same national government is allocating the same money that they've been doing before They're still constructing dams, which should be the work of the county governments. They're still doing. They don't want to let go. So this is the problem of many of the water boards. Regional authorities. All those things in the constitution should have been devolved. So we have a situation where there's duplication of of functions, and costly, a very costly affair. But more importantly, I think the main issue here is if the government rationalized ministries the way it's envisaged in the constitution, we will not have this. And I think it will be interesting to see how the IMF, because it's one of the requirements now that they have to rationalize, on public servants. It will be interesting to see how they will do it. But that is the challenge. There is no commitment to what is provided for in the constitution. But then we will not be having this crisis where a governor would wake up and say, I want to recruit. They took over the entire workers of the local governments. And that discussion on how much of those employees should be retained and how much we should let go has been a discussion, and so there are a lot of interest. Most of the time it's really not about the requirements of the law, but it's people wanting to retain for political purpose. I want to recruit more people, I want to retain more staff. It's politics, so that you don't lose. There are a lot of factors that come into play which have nothing to do with really the way government should run it is. So it's political expediency sometimes that plays a role. But I think it should not be really 500 billion. It should be lower.
It should be lower.
Yeah. I think the other thing, Bill has talked about just the structure of government and the numbers, but I think the whole area of adoption of e-government, that thing has been a thorn in the flesh since 2012. The fact that the whole of government should be running on a digital system that allows transactions to happen fairly quickly. But now you're bringing in people to make transactions happen, and when you do that, they actually become much slower. And that is really that's the reality of government. So this wage bill could actually be substantially cut down purely by digitizing the operations of government, the interconnection.
Like e-citizen.
Yeah,
really excellent.
E-citizen is excellent. But that needs to be expanded into all the activities of government. If you go to a government building and look at the amount of paper pushing that is there, and this, the archetypal photograph of a PS with one, with one pile of files there and another pile of files here, and it's in the middle there talking to different to a delegation. Yeah, that needs to disappear.
It's by design. It's forensicing.
Yeah.
If you digitalize, the opportunity for forensicing will disappear.
Will disappear. Yeah. So if you did that, then this cost would come down at least 30%. If you digitize, that's my expectation from what we've done in the private sector, and also it means services quicker, and I think the whole economy would be kick-started purely by having quicker decision making and more digitization.
But let me hear from McPhee before I ask the next question.
Well, I had a friend who went to, I don't know whether it was the Ministry of Immigration or where it was, but I think he was actually required to do all of his, his fingerprints.
Fingerprinting, yeah.
And it may have been to get, a certificate of good conduct or whatever it is. But, he told this lady, he said, well, actually I've done this a number of times, and couldn't this be stored on a server so that I don't have to come and do it again? And she says, well, I need a job. I need a job, and this is the reality on the ground. You see that it's you've got to remember. I had a friend who his work was actually, because at one stage a number of years ago the government was reducing its number of staff, and he was a person who used to sign all of these letters. You see. And he would send these letters out, and well, sorry, your time of being in government has now come to an end. So this is the end of your sorry, you got to go home. And then one day he got the letter that he had actually been signing and sending to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. He got that letter, and this was such a shock. In fact, he went home, sat in front of the TV, bought a whole lot of rat poison, drank it, and his wife came home in the evening and he was sitting watching the TV, dead. He'd committed suicide. So, I think it's very, very easy to talk, well, like send people home and so on. We have a massive problem of unemployment, which is a worldwide problem. It's not a problem only in Kenya, okay? But, especially young people, and, this is where I personally feel that we've got to try to work on very, very many more small and medium-sized enterprises so that we give people an alternative. Very often in Kenya, let's face it, you're forced to be an entrepreneur. You don't have that natural skill, but the only way you're going to survive is by having, as you were mentioning a little bit earlier, your hustle, okay? But even there, I've got an incredibly, clever young lady. She said, well, I don't think she'll ever lose her job because she's so bright. But this lady said, look, I'm going to start my side hustle. She started a shop. You've got to get all your licenses for this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth. She employed 2 people. She was renting the place. She would come at the end of the day and say, well, okay, how sales go? No, we weren't able to sell anything. When you actually talk to the people around, they are selling like hot cakes there. Now, what were the 2 employees doing? They were actually selling their own produce and not her. So she had, after a number of months of losses, she decided to close the business. Now, this is happening again and again and again in Kenya. I could tell you so many stories like this. So we go back to the idea of trust.
Yes.
We've got to have honesty as one of our national values. We got to understand. I have a friend, Kevin Kamau. He had to send home a person who was meant to actually collect eggs from his 60 layers, and he would bring about 2 or 3 eggs a day. So he said, okay, let me sell all my chickens, send this man home, and now this man is coming and saying, look, Bunny, now I don't have a job any longer, so I need money. Give me some money. But we're working, and this obviously is happening on a national scale, I can tell you. When we were saying, the counties are going to provide more employment. For whom? For the MCAs, for the county governors. We have a Professor Ruth Kiraka at Strathmore Business School, and she actually carried out a study. Well, she was in charge of a study which examined the views of women in 20 different counties. Every one was the same. There is incredible nepotism in those counties. Incredible. So the point is, in theory, take government down to that level. People will hold you accountable. But is that what really happens on the ground in Kenya? We've got to ask ourselves, I think, look, how are things working? Let's see a solution which, we can talk about it here. As a friend of mine says, well, we have a lot of talk shops in Kenya. We don't have workshops. They're talk shops. Because we talk, and what happens?
The
Nothing.
talking shop, yes.
Nothing. So, you see, I feel that, these are matters we've got to think about. Kenya's not going to end tomorrow. We've got to think about, what are the children of Kenya going to be doing? Are they going to be, I've got a past student, an incredibly bright young lady. She's got a job in Bermuda. I've got another man, an incredibly bright young man. He's got a job in London. Now, these are the best brains in Kenya leaving Kenya. Why? Because very many people are talking about, we're going to create jobs and so on. In fact, they're doing exactly the opposite. I know 3 businesses which never started up because a very big person in Kenya came along and said, you give me 20% free. And that just killed the business. So, we've got, but I think the solution is to have many small businesses, because small businesses, probably, I don't know, he's probably employing many people that if it was a huge organization, they'll be looking at their staff costs all the time and trying to reduce. But I think also, in relation to this 500 billion, I think it's important just to point out, I don't think our teachers are included here. Because when you look at the Kenya budget,
Yes.
the biggest line item at the moment is interest on our debt. The second biggest is what goes to the counties. The third biggest is the TSC. Because you have a lot of teachers in government primary schools, in government secondary schools, and that wage cost is much bigger than this, but it's almost $1 trillion shillings. So it's a much bigger number than this number here. You know, so this number 500 billion. It's what Patrick, you know.
So this is a conservative figure that we have here.
Well, exactly. In fact, it's not the total wage bill.
It's
in
not
fact, no.
The issue of rationalization, because we had, and I'll always keep on harping on that, the Abdikadir task force that we had to rationalize on this parastatus, as it were. Do you think now with the next administration we should reconsider that particular report that has not been, of course, effected up to now, 10 years down the line? And the question of also staff auditing, especially from this parastatus. We've seen what is happening with KEMSA. A bloated staff of how many? Almost 2,000. Now they've pared down to almost 365 staff. All the extra figures of staff that we had there were not needed there, because even when you look at the staff audit and what was supposed to be the operational staff, there was around 400 staff, but we had a bloated staff as it is. Could we begin from there?
I think it's critical. You know, in the past the government had some room, if you will. Today the government that comes in the next few weeks has its job cut out for them. Very, very difficult, because we have a situation where the debt they have to service, spend almost over 1.3 trillion shillings to service debt annually. They have to provide for all the pledges they have made. Many of these pledges are about employment creation. And if you look at those manifestos and you study them critically, it's about creating job in government. You know, including setting up factories in every county for this, you know, giving money for welfare, 6,000 shillings, I don't know, giving money to Mama Mboga, give money to this, give money to that, provide extension. It's about creating employment. So really, you're going to expand government big time if these guys implement some of the pledges in their manifesto. But the reality is, unless they cut down on public spending, the budget deficit will increase. If the deficit increases, they have to borrow. And if they borrow, so we are in a vicious cycle. So someone has to stand up and say, no, gentlemen, we cannot expand government, period. Let us look for other ways of providing for Kenyans. Let us look for other ways of creating jobs. We can't. Some leader has to stand up and say, no, in my government there'll be no expansion, because I have to reduce public spending. That's the only way I can cut down on my deficit and reduce borrowing. Now, for the state corporations, for example, when Abdul Qadir and his team did that several years ago, things were rosy. Things have changed significantly. Kenya Pipeline, Kenya Power Lighting was profitable then. It is now a basket case. You know, all the way to Kenya Pipeline, all the way to many of the state corporations that hitherto were very profitable and they were self-sustaining, have